Step away from the vehicle right now. The command cut through the late afternoon air in the luxury parking plaza like a siren no one expected to hear. Conversation stopped. A car door halfway closed froze in place. A couple walking toward a restaurant slowed their steps. In the center of it all stood a black Lamborghini Aventador gleaming under the Texas sun, its polished surface reflecting palm trees, glass storefronts, and a crowd that had suddenly grown curious. Beside it stood a tall black man in a simple charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. His hand still rested calmly on the driver's side door handle as if he had just finished unlocking the car. The police cruiser parked behind him hummed quietly, its lights flashing in slow rotations that painted the pavement red and blue. Officer Ryan Fletcher stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed the situation had already been decided. "Sir, I said step away from the vehicle," he repeated, louder this time. The man beside the Lamborghini didn't move. Not because he was refusing. Not because he was nervous. He simply looked at the officer with a calm expression that seemed almost out of place in a moment that had already drawn half the parking lot's attention. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Fletcher tilted his head toward the car like it was obvious. "This vehicle was reported stolen 10 minutes ago." A murmur passed through the small crowd gathering near the sidewalk. A stolen Lamborghini. That alone was enough to make people pause. But the way the officer said it made it sound like the case was already solved. The man standing beside the car glanced briefly at the Aventador's sleek black finish, then back at the officer. His voice stayed even, measured, almost relaxed. "That's interesting," he said. "Because it's my car." Fletcher laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that said he had heard excuses like that before. "Sure it is," he replied. "And I suppose you've got proof of that somewhere." The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply slid his phone from his pocket and checked the screen like someone confirming the time. The Lamborghini's engine clicked softly as it cooled under the heat. A few more people drifted closer now, drawn by curiosity. One teenager lifted his phone and quietly started recording. Another woman whispered to her friend, "That's a $400,000 car." Fletcher noticed the growing audience and squared his shoulders a little straighter. "Look," he said, lowering his tone slightly but keeping the authority in it. "Someone matching your description was seen near this vehicle earlier, and the owner reported it missing. So before this turns into something bigger, I suggest you step away and let us sort it out." The man beside the Lamborghini nodded slowly, like he was processing the logic. "Someone matching my description?" he repeated. Fletcher gestured toward the hoodie, the jeans, the sneakers. "Yeah, you." Another ripple moved through the crowd. The man finally stepped back from the car, but not in surrender. More like he was giving the officer space to continue the performance. The sun dipped lower over the row of upscale boutiques, casting long shadows across the parking lot. A white Range Rover rolled past slowly, its driver staring through the window at the unusual scene. "What's your name?" Fletcher asked. The man slid his phone back into his pocket. "Adrian Cole." Fletcher scribbled something in a small notebook. "All right, Mr. Cole," he said, the name sounding skeptical on his tongue. "Where exactly did you get this vehicle?" Adrian looked at the Lamborghini again, almost amused by the question. "From the dealership," he answered. Fletcher's pen paused midair. "Which dealership?" Adrian's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Mine." A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Fletcher didn't smile back. "Right," he said flatly. "Your dealership." He walked slowly around the Lamborghini, studying it as though the car itself might confirm his version of events. The Aventador's glossy paint reflected his uniform in distorted waves. "Funny thing about stolen cars," Fletcher continued. "They usually end up in the hands of someone who thinks no one's paying attention." Adrian folded his arms loosely. "And yet everyone's watching right now." He wasn't wrong. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 people. Phones were out. A delivery driver leaned against his van. Observing like this was better than anything on television. Fletcher noticed the cameras and cleared his throat. "Sir, do you have identification on you?" Adrian reached calmly into his pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He held it out without urgency. Fletcher examined the driver's license, eyes narrowing slightly as he read the name again. "Adrian Cole." The officer glanced up, comparing the face in front of him to the photo on the card. "And you're telling me this Lamborghini belongs to you?" Adrian nodded once. "That's correct." Fletcher handed the license back, but didn't seem convinced. Then you won't mind if we verify that. Adrian shrugged. Not at all. The officer stepped aside to speak quietly into his radio. The static crackled softly as he relayed the license number and license plate to dispatch. The parking lot had grown strangely quiet now. Even the usual hum of traffic from the nearby boulevard seemed distant. Adrian rested one hand casually on the roof of the Lamborghini, like a man leaning against his own front porch railing. The teenager filming whispered to his friend, "This is going to go viral." A moment later, Fletcher's radio crackled again, but before the officer could respond, another police SUV pulled into the lot. It rolled to a stop beside the cruiser with deliberate authority. The driver stepped out slowly, adjusting the brim of his cap. Police Chief Charles Benton. His presence immediately shifted the mood. Benton scanned the scene, his gaze settling first on the Lamborghini, then on Adrian. "What's going on here?" he asked. Fletcher gestured toward the car. "Possible auto theft, Chief." Benton studied Adrian from head to toe, the hoodie, the jeans, the sneakers, the relaxed posture. "This your vehicle?" he asked. Adrian answered with the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "Yes." Benton's eyebrows lifted slightly. He looked back at the Lamborghini like it had just told a joke. "That's quite a car," he said. Adrian didn't reply. Benton turned to Fletcher. "And you're sure about the report?" Fletcher nodded. "Came in about 10 minutes ago." Benton looked at Adrian again, his expression unreadable but unmistakably skeptical. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing the tension tightening like a drawn wire. "You know," Benton said slowly, "people who drive cars like this usually dress a little differently." The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying the chief as though memorizing the moment. The Lamborghini's black paint reflected the entire scene like a mirror. 2 officers, a crowd of strangers, and one man who looked completely unbothered by the storm forming around him. Adrian reached into his pocket again and unlocked his phone. He tapped the number, lifted it to his ear, and spoke only 6 quiet words. "It's time. Bring the contract." Then he lowered the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Fletcher frowned. Benton crossed his arms. The crowd leaned forward. And somewhere across the city, an engine started. The parking lot did not move for several seconds after Adrian Cole ended the call. The air felt strangely suspended, as if the entire plaza had paused to wait for something no one could yet see. Officer Ryan Fletcher stood beside the Lamborghini Aventador with his arms folded, the flashing patrol lights still painting slow red and blue circles across the polished pavement. Chief Charles Benton remained a few steps behind him, watching Adrian with a mixture of doubt and impatience. The small crowd that had gathered continued to grow as more pedestrians noticed the scene. A man carrying a shopping bag stopped near the curb. A young couple leaned against a silver sedan. Phones were raised quietly but steadily, their cameras capturing every moment. Adrian Cole did not seem bothered by any of it. He stood beside the sleek black Lamborghini, as if he were simply waiting for a valet at a restaurant rather than being questioned by the police in front of 20 strangers. The sun had shifted lower in the sky now, and its warm light reflected off the sharp lines of the Aventador's hood. Chief Benton finally broke the silence. "You made a phone call," he said slowly. "To who exactly?" Adrian glanced at him with the same calm expression. "Someone who can clear this up quickly." Benton exhaled through his nose, clearly unconvinced. "You know, Mr. Cole, we get situations like this more often than people think. Expensive cars, complicated stories, people claiming ownership when the paperwork tells a different story." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "And what does the paperwork say right now?" Fletcher shifted his weight. "Dispatch is still checking the registration." The crowd remained quiet, but the mood had shifted from curiosity to anticipation. People sensed that something unusual was unfolding, though no one could yet say exactly what. A teenage boy wearing a baseball cap whispered to the girl beside him that the car alone was worth more than half the houses in their neighborhood. Another voice murmured that the man standing beside it did not look nervous at all. That detail made the entire moment feel stranger. Most people accused of stealing a vehicle would argue or protest. Adrian did neither. Instead, he looked across the plaza toward the glass storefronts reflecting the scene like a mirror. In the reflection, he could see the patrol lights, the crowd, the officers, and himself standing quietly in the center of it all. It reminded him of something he had learned years ago when he was much younger and far less patient. Attention could be louder than anger. The sound of an approaching engine broke the stillness. It was not loud or dramatic, just the smooth, steady rumble of a vehicle turning into the parking lot from the main boulevard. Several heads turned at once. A black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly toward the scene and stopped a short distance away. The driver stepped out first. He wore a navy suit despite the warm evening air and carried a thin leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Behind him, another woman stepped out of the passenger's side, holding a tablet computer. They did not rush. They walked calmly toward Adrian as if they had arrived exactly when they expected to. Fletcher watched them approach with a puzzled expression. "Do you know these people?" he asked Adrian. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Chief Benton narrowed his eyes. The man in the navy suit reached them first and stopped beside Adrian with a respectful nod. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," he said. His voice was professional and steady. "We came as quickly as possible." Adrian returned the nod. "Thank you, Daniel." The woman with the tablet stood just behind them, already opening the screen as if preparing to show something important. Fletcher looked between the newcomers and Adrian. "And you are?" The man in the suit extended a hand politely. "Daniel Harper, legal counsel." Fletcher did not shake it. Instead, he looked back at Chief Benton, as if expecting instructions. Benton stepped forward slowly. "Legal counsel for what exactly?" Harper glanced at Adrian briefly before answering. "For Mr. Adrian Cole, and for Cole Automotive Holdings." The name drifted across the crowd like a quiet spark. Some people looked at each other with confusion, while others seemed to recognize it instantly. A man near the back of the group whispered something under his breath and pulled out his phone to search the name. Fletcher frowned. "What does that have to do with this vehicle?" Harper opened the leather portfolio and removed several documents, holding them carefully so the evening light fell across the printed pages. "Quite a lot, actually," he replied. "This Lamborghini Aventador is registered to Cole Automotive Holdings under the name Adrian Cole." Fletcher blinked once, then again. Dispatch said the vehicle was reported missing. Harper nodded calmly. "Yes. Earlier this afternoon, the vehicle's tracking system triggered a routine alert while it was being transported between facilities. The system automatically flagged it as missing until the driver confirmed its location. That confirmation was completed 15 minutes ago." The words landed softly but carried weight. Fletcher turned slightly toward Benton. The chief's expression had hardened, but he said nothing yet. Harper continued speaking with the same professional tone. "Mr. Cole was retrieving the vehicle personally this evening when your officer approached him." The woman with the tablet stepped forward and rotated the screen so Benton and Fletcher could see it. On the display were digital records showing the vehicle identification number, ownership documentation, and the corporate registration under Cole Automotive Holdings. Fletcher studied the screen for several seconds. The numbers matched the license plate on the Lamborghini. Benton folded his arms tighter. "Even if that is accurate," he said slowly, "that does not explain why the initial report suggested theft." Adrian spoke for the first time since the arrival of the legal team. "Because the system was never designed to assume the owner would be the one picking up the car." His voice remained calm, but the sentence carried a quiet edge. The crowd murmured again. Several people had already started searching Adrian Cole's name on their phones, and the results appearing on their screens were beginning to change the mood entirely. One man near the front lowered his phone and whispered to the woman beside him. "That is him." Fletcher noticed the whispers spreading and glanced uneasily toward Benton. The chief remained silent, but the confidence that had filled his posture earlier had begun to fade slightly. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini. "You asked earlier where I got the car," he said evenly. "The answer has not changed." Harper closed the portfolio slowly. "Mr. Cole owns Cole Automotive Holdings," he added, "which operates dealerships and manufacturing partnerships across several states." The teenager recording the scene widened his eyes and quietly said that he had just found the company online. Another person in the crowd repeated the name aloud, and within seconds more phones were lighting up with the same search results. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Chief," he said under his breath, "I think we may need to verify this again." Benton did not answer immediately. He looked from Adrian to the Lamborghini, then to the growing crowd, now watching with far greater interest than before. Adrian remained still, patient, composed. The evening breeze shifted across the parking lot, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the boulevard. Somewhere nearby, a restaurant door opened and closed as more curious customers stepped outside to see what was happening. Benton finally spoke. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "why did you not explain this earlier?" Adrian's expression remained steady. "Because I already did." The answer hung in the air like a quiet mirror reflecting the entire situation back at them. Harper adjusted his tie slightly. "We understand misunderstandings occur," he said politely. "However, this one has drawn quite a bit of attention." Fletcher glanced at the cameras pointed toward them and shifted uncomfortably. The red and blue patrol lights continued to flash across the polished black Lamborghini, but the scene now felt completely different than it had 10 minutes earlier. What had started as a simple accusation had turned into something far more complicated. Adrian looked around the parking lot slowly, taking in the faces of the crowd, the officers, the reflection of the Lamborghini's sharp lines in the evening light. Then he spoke quietly, almost as if he were finishing a thought rather than starting a confrontation. "You believe the car did not belong to me," he said. "But the truth is much bigger than that." Benton's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Adrian met his gaze calmly. "This car," he said, resting his hand on the Aventador's roof, "is only one small part of what I own." And as the crowd absorbed those words, the entire atmosphere of the parking lot shifted again, because the realization spreading through the bystanders was beginning to reveal something the officers had not yet fully understood. "I own the company that built half the dealerships in this state." Adrian Cole's voice was calm when he said it, but the sentence landed with a quiet weight that rippled through the parking lot like a sudden change in the wind. For a moment no one spoke. The red and blue reflections from the patrol lights continued to glide slowly across the Lamborghini Aventador's polished black surface, but the scene surrounding the car had changed. A few people in the crowd had already confirmed the name on their phones, and the whispers that followed were no longer confused. They were surprised. One man near the front lowered his phone slowly and said under his breath that Cole Automotive Holdings had dealerships in 5 different states. Another woman quietly added that the company had recently partnered with several luxury manufacturers. Officer Ryan Fletcher shifted his stance, the earlier certainty in his posture replaced by something less solid. Chief Charles Benton remained still, studying Adrian with a new level of attention. The evening air felt cooler now as the sun dipped lower behind the glass buildings lining the plaza. Adrian stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, one hand resting lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini, as though the entire situation had always been under control. Daniel Harper closed the leather portfolio with deliberate care. The documents inside were no longer the focus of the moment. The crowd had already begun to connect the pieces themselves. Fletcher cleared his throat quietly. He looked toward the police cruiser, then back toward Benton, as if hoping the chief would take over the conversation. Benton stepped forward slowly, his gaze still fixed on Adrian. The chief's voice remained firm, but it had lost some of the edge it carried earlier. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "you mentioned owning a company. That does not automatically explain everything that happened here today." Adrian nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "No," he said calmly, "but it explains a lot more than you think." Benton folded his arms, watching him closely. "Then perhaps you should explain." Adrian looked around the parking lot slowly. The small crowd that had gathered was now larger than before. A delivery driver leaned against his van with interest. A group of college students had stopped near the edge of the sidewalk, their phones held steadily toward the scene. The teenager with the baseball cap was still recording, his eyes wide as he realized the moment had become far more significant than he expected when he first lifted his camera. Adrian glanced briefly at Daniel Harper before speaking again. "Cole Automotive Holdings does more than sell cars," he said. His voice carried easily through the quiet plaza without needing to rise. "We design distribution networks. We fund vehicle fleets. We manage several transportation partnerships across the country." A man near the front of the crowd whispered that he had just found the company website. Another person said they had seen the name in a business article earlier that year. Fletcher listened to the murmurs spreading through the bystanders and shifted again, clearly aware that the situation had moved beyond a simple roadside investigation. Harper added calmly, "The Lamborghini you see here is part of a demonstration fleet used for several of our partner dealerships." Benton glanced at the car again, then back at Adrian. "A demonstration fleet." Adrian nodded. Yes. The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. And you personally came to pick it up tonight. Correct. Fletcher spoke before Benton could respond. That still does not explain why the system flagged the vehicle as missing. The woman with the tablet, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward slightly. It flagged automatically when the transport driver paused the delivery route, she said. The alert was cleared once the location was verified. She rotated the tablet so the officers could see the confirmation timestamp again. Fletcher studied it in silence. The digital record clearly showed the alert had been resolved before the officers arrived. The crowd continued murmuring quietly as more people confirmed the information appearing on their phones. Adrian remained composed, watching the officers with the same steady patience he had shown from the beginning. It was the kind of calm that made the moment feel strangely balanced, as though the tension in the parking lot had reached a point where the next word spoken would change everything. Benton looked at Adrian again, his expression thoughtful now rather than skeptical. You said earlier that this car is only a small part of what you own. Adrian nodded. That is right. The chief waited. Adrian let the silence sit for a moment longer before continuing. Cole Automotive Holdings also funds the fleet contracts for several municipal departments. Fletcher frowned slightly. Municipal departments? Harper spoke quietly. Including the city vehicle program. Fletcher blinked once. Benton's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The chief glanced briefly toward the police cruiser parked behind them. The logo of the city police department was clearly visible on the door, illuminated by the flashing patrol lights. Adrian followed his gaze. 3 years ago, he said calmly, our company entered a partnership to upgrade several municipal fleets. The murmurs in the crowd faded as people listened more closely. That program included transportation services, maintenance contracts, and vehicle replacements for a number of departments. Fletcher looked back at the Lamborghini, then at the cruiser again as if trying to connect the implication forming in his mind. Harper added evenly, including law enforcement vehicles. The statement hung in the air like a quiet revelation. Several people in the crowd turned toward the patrol car instinctively, noticing details they had not paid attention to before. The upgraded light bars, the newer vehicle model, the department logo printed along the door panel. Adrian's voice remained steady. Our company helped finance the replacement program. Benton did not speak immediately. The chief's gaze shifted slowly from the cruiser to Adrian again. The earlier confidence in his expression had softened into something closer to realization. Fletcher looked toward Benton again, uncertain now about where the conversation was headed. Adrian rested both hands loosely in his jacket pockets. So when I said this car is only a small part of what I own, he continued quietly, I meant that literally. The crowd had gone nearly silent now. Phones remained raised, capturing every second, but the voices had faded as the realization spread through the group. The teenager recording the video whispered to his friend that the man standing beside the Lamborghini might actually be responsible for funding the very vehicles parked behind the officers. Fletcher shifted again, clearly aware of the direction the moment had taken. Benton exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. The chief looked around the parking lot once more before focusing on Adrian. Mr. Cole, he said carefully, are you telling me that your company participates in the city fleet program? Adrian nodded once. Yes. Benton looked toward Harper for confirmation. The attorney simply inclined his head. That is correct. The red and blue reflections from the patrol lights continued to move across the pavement, but the authority those lights had carried earlier now felt strangely different. Fletcher glanced again at the cruiser parked behind him. For the first time since the situation began, he looked uncertain. Adrian watched the shift calmly. The evening breeze moved across the plaza again, carrying distant sounds from the boulevard. Somewhere nearby a restaurant door opened and closed as more curious bystanders stepped outside to see what had captured everyone's attention. Benton finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. Mr. Cole, he said, this situation may have been misunderstood. Adrian studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. Yes, he said, it was. The chief hesitated before continuing. Perhaps we should clarify things moving forward. Adrian looked briefly at the crowd surrounding them. Then he returned his gaze to Benton with the same calm expression he had carried from the very beginning. That would be a good idea, he said quietly, because what happens next will determine whether this moment becomes a misunderstanding or something much larger. And as the words settled over the plaza, the flashing lights from the patrol car reflected across the black Lamborghini again, illuminating the faces of the officers, the crowd, and the man who had just revealed that the situation in front of them was far bigger than anyone had first imagined. The parking lot remained silent for several seconds after Adrian Cole finished speaking, but it was not the same silence from earlier. This one carried weight. The kind of silence that happens when people suddenly realize they are standing in the middle of a moment that is about to change direction. The flashing patrol lights continued to rotate slowly, painting the glossy black surface of the Lamborghini Aventador in red and blue reflections. But the authority those lights once carried now felt strangely uncertain. Chief Charles Benton stood still, studying Adrian in a way he had not done before. Earlier he had looked at the man beside the Lamborghini and seen a situation to control. Now he looked at him and saw a variable he had not accounted for. Officer Ryan Fletcher shifted his stance again, his earlier confidence fading into something more cautious. The crowd surrounding the scene had grown larger. People had stopped leaving the restaurants along the plaza and now stood along the sidewalk watching quietly. Nearly every person held a phone. The teenager with the baseball cap continued recording, his arms slightly trembling from the length of time he had been holding the camera up. A woman beside him whispered that the video had already started circulating in group chats. Another man said the name Adrian Cole had appeared in a financial magazine article he had read the month before. Adrian did not react to any of the whispers. He simply stood beside the Lamborghini as though the entire evening had unfolded exactly the way he expected it would. Daniel Harper remained beside him with the leather portfolio tucked calmly under his arm. The assistant holding the tablet continued reviewing documents on the screen, occasionally glancing up to monitor the conversation between Adrian and the officers. Chief Benton finally spoke again, but the firmness in his voice had softened slightly. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "you understand our officers were responding to a report. When a luxury vehicle appears to be missing, we are obligated to investigate." Adrian nodded slowly. "I understand the responsibility of investigation," he replied. "What I do not understand is the assumption." Benton held his gaze. "Assumption?" Adrian looked briefly toward the Lamborghini again before answering. "You arrived and decided I did not look like the person who owned the vehicle." The words were spoken calmly, but they landed with precision. A few people in the crowd exchanged quiet glances. Fletcher looked down briefly before shifting his weight again. Benton exhaled slowly. "This situation is evolving," he said. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Yes," he replied. "It is." The evening breeze moved through the plaza again, rustling the leaves of the decorative trees lining the sidewalk. The sound of distant traffic drifted through the air, but the parking lot itself remained focused entirely on the conversation unfolding beside the Lamborghini. Harper adjusted his glasses slightly and spoke in a steady professional tone. "Chief Benton, our only concern is that the matter be resolved accurately and respectfully." Benton nodded once without looking away from Adrian. "That is our goal as well." Fletcher cleared his throat quietly. "Dispatch has confirmed the ownership records," he said. The statement did not surprise anyone at this point, but hearing it spoken aloud caused another ripple through the crowd. The teenager recording whispered that the officers had just verified everything. Adrian did not smile. He simply acknowledged the confirmation with a small nod. Benton glanced briefly toward the police cruiser again before returning his attention to Adrian. The chief's posture had changed subtly. The earlier air of command had been replaced with careful calculation. "Mr. Cole," he said, "your company participates in the municipal fleet program." Adrian nodded. "Yes." Benton folded his arms again. "That means we have a working relationship with your organization." Adrian's voice remained even. "Yes." Benton hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Then perhaps we can address this situation with cooperation." Adrian considered the statement quietly. The crowd leaned forward slightly as though the entire plaza had become an audience waiting for the next line of a play. "Cooperation requires clarity," Adrian said. Benton narrowed his eyes slightly. "Explain." Adrian gestured gently toward the Lamborghini. "A report was made that this car was stolen." Fletcher nodded cautiously. "Correct." Adrian continued. "You arrived and saw me standing beside it." Fletcher nodded again. Adrian met Benton's gaze directly. And within seconds the conversation turned to whether someone like me should be driving a car like this. The sentence carried no anger, but it carried truth. The crowd reacted with a soft wave of murmurs. Several people who had heard the earlier comment shifted uncomfortably. Benton remained silent for a moment longer than anyone expected. Finally he spoke. That statement may have been poorly phrased. Adrian watched him carefully. Words reveal assumptions, he said quietly. Harper added calmly. And assumptions shape decisions. Fletcher looked between them, clearly aware that the moment had become far more complicated than the simple vehicle investigation he had expected when he arrived. Benton rubbed his chin thoughtfully before speaking again. Mr. Cole, the reality is that officers must make rapid judgments in uncertain situations. Adrian nodded slightly. That is true. Benton continued. But those judgments are based on limited information. Adrian's expression remained steady. That is also true. The chief seemed relieved to hear the agreement. But Adrian continued speaking before Benton could respond again. However, he said quietly, the difference between observation and assumption is what happens next. The words lingered in the warm evening air. Fletcher glanced again at the growing number of phones pointed toward them. The officer realized that every word being spoken was likely being recorded. The teenager with the baseball cap had not lowered his phone once. The camera remained fixed directly on Adrian and the officers. Benton noticed the same thing. He slowly turned his head and took in the size of the crowd surrounding them. It was no longer just curious pedestrians. People from the nearby restaurants had stepped outside to watch. Several employees from nearby shops stood near the entrance doors observing the scene. Benton returned his attention to Adrian. What exactly do you believe should happen now? He asked. Adrian looked around the parking lot once more before answering. The fading sunlight reflected across the black Lamborghini, illuminating the sharp angles of its design like polished glass. The patrol lights continued flashing, but now they felt almost symbolic rather than commanding. Adrian spoke slowly and clearly. That depends on how this department chooses to address the assumptions that brought us here. The crowd grew quiet again. Benton studied him carefully. You are suggesting there is a larger issue. Adrian nodded once. I am suggesting that moments like this do not exist in isolation. Harper added softly. And how institutions respond to those moments determines public trust. Fletcher shifted again, glancing toward Benton as if waiting for direction. The chief remained silent, clearly weighing the situation. Adrian's calm presence had shifted the balance of the entire encounter. What had begun as a routine investigation now carried implications that extended far beyond a single parking lot. Benton finally spoke again, his voice more measured than before. Mr. Cole, he said, our priority is ensuring this situation ends appropriately. Adrian nodded slightly. Then the next step is simple. Benton raised an eyebrow. Which is? Adrian looked directly at him and said quietly, accountability. The word hung in the air like a quiet echo. Several people in the crowd nodded subtly, as though they had been waiting to hear it spoken aloud. Benton stood still for a moment longer before responding. Accountability can take many forms. Adrian's voice remained calm. That is true. Benton folded his arms again. So what form do you believe it should take tonight? Adrian looked toward the police cruiser once more, then back to Benton. His expression remained composed, but there was a quiet certainty in his eyes now that had not been visible earlier. Tonight, he said slowly, will determine what happens next. The statement caused another wave of murmurs in the crowd. Phones continued recording. The evening light had dimmed slightly as the sun moved lower behind the buildings. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini again, as if anchoring the moment in place. Benton watched him carefully, sensing that the next decision would define how the entire situation would be remembered. And as the flashing lights reflected across the car and the faces of the watching crowd, the atmosphere in the parking lot shifted once again, because everyone present could feel that the moment had reached the point where the balance of authority was about to change. The word accountability lingered in the warm evening air long after Adrian Cole finished speaking it. No one in the parking lot moved for a moment. The flashing red and blue reflections from the patrol cruiser continued to sweep slowly across the black Lamborghini Aventador, across the pavement, across the faces of the crowd that had grown larger with every passing minute. The scene no longer felt like a routine police response. It felt like a moment suspended between two very different outcomes. Chief Charles Benton stood with his arms folded, studying Adrian carefully. The chief had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a situation had shifted beyond the original report. What had begun as a simple vehicle alert had now become something much more complicated. Officer Ryan Fletcher stood beside the patrol car, his earlier certainty replaced by visible tension. The officer glanced toward the growing crowd, and then toward the teenager still holding up his phone, recording every word. Fletcher realized something he had not considered when he first stepped out of his cruiser. The moment was no longer just an interaction between an officer and a citizen. It had become an audience. Adrian remained calm beside the Lamborghini, one hand resting lightly on the smooth black roof, as if the car were simply part of the background rather than the center of the conflict. His posture was relaxed, but his presence carried a quiet gravity that held the attention of everyone watching. Daniel Harper stood a few steps behind him with the leather portfolio still tucked beneath his arm, his expression composed and observant. The assistant with the tablet continued monitoring the digital documents, occasionally glancing up toward the officers. Chief Benton finally spoke again, his voice measured. "Mr. Cole," he said, "situations like this can escalate quickly if people assume the worst about each other." Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering the sentence. "That is true," he replied calmly. "But the assumption did not come from me." A soft ripple moved through the crowd as several bystanders exchanged quiet looks. The earlier comment from Benton about who looked like they belonged in a car like this had not been forgotten. Fletcher shifted his weight again and cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Benton seemed aware of it as well. The chief lowered his arms and stepped forward slightly, as though trying to re-establish control of the moment. "Let us focus on resolving the situation," he said. Adrian nodded once. "That is exactly what I want." The evening breeze moved gently across the plaza again, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the faint hum of conversation from nearby restaurants. The sky above the glass buildings had begun to soften into early evening colors, and the lights from the storefronts were starting to glow. The teenager recording whispered quietly to someone beside him that the video already had dozens of viewers watching through a live stream. Several people in the crowd leaned closer, curious about what would happen next. Benson glanced briefly toward the police cruiser again before returning his attention to Adrian. "The ownership of the vehicle has been confirmed," he said. Adrian nodded again. "Yes." Benton continued carefully. "Which means the initial concern about the vehicle being stolen is no longer relevant." Adrian looked at the Lamborghini for a moment before speaking again. "The car was never the real issue." Benton raised an eyebrow slightly. "Then what was?" Adrian's voice remained steady. "Perception." The word was simple, but it landed with clarity. Harper spoke quietly beside him. "When authority meets assumption, perception becomes the story people remember." Several members of the crowd nodded subtly, as though the sentence had captured what they had been thinking. Fletcher looked toward Benton again, waiting for direction. The chief remained thoughtful, clearly aware that every response now carried weight beyond the parking lot. Adrian watched him calmly. The CEO did not look angry. He did not look triumphant either. Instead, he looked like someone who had already experienced moments like this before and had learned how to navigate them with patience rather than confrontation. Benton finally spoke again. "Mr. Cole," he said, "the department does not benefit from misunderstandings like this." Adrian met his gaze directly. "Neither does the public." Another ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. The assistant with the tablet stepped forward slightly and showed Harper something on the screen. Harper nodded quietly before turning his attention back to the chief. "Chief Benton," he said in a calm professional tone, "there is another factor that should probably be considered." Benton looked toward him. "What factor?" Harper opened the portfolio again and removed another document. The paper caught the light from the patrol car's flashing lamps. "Earlier this year," he said, "Cole Automotive Holdings renewed a multi-year service agreement with the city transportation program." Benton's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened. Harper continued speaking clearly so that everyone nearby could hear. "That agreement includes maintenance and replacement services for several municipal vehicle fleets." Fletcher looked toward the patrol cruiser again, the implication beginning to register more clearly now. Harper finished the sentence with calm precision. "Including the fleet currently operated by the police department." The words settled over the crowd like a quiet shift in gravity. Several people turned instinctively toward the cruiser parked behind the officers. The reflection of the department logo shimmered across the polished door panel under the rotating lights. Adrian spoke again, his voice still calm and measured. 3 years ago, the city needed to modernize its vehicle program, he said. Our company invested in that transition. Benton absorbed the information without interrupting. The chief had clearly been aware of the fleet partnership in a general sense, but hearing it stated directly in the middle of the current situation changed the atmosphere entirely. Fletcher looked suddenly uncertain about where to place his attention. The patrol car behind him no longer felt like a symbol of authority. It felt like a reminder of the relationship Adrian had just described. The crowd sensed the shift as well. The teenager recording whispered again that the man standing beside the Lamborghini might actually be responsible for the vehicles used by the officers themselves. Benton exhaled slowly. The chief had been in public service long enough to recognize when a moment required careful judgment. Mr. Cole, he said quietly, the partnership between your company and the city is valued. Adrian nodded once. I am glad to hear that. Benton hesitated briefly before continuing. However, tonight's situation was never intended to become a public confrontation. Adrian's expression remained calm. Intent and impact are rarely the same thing. Harper closed the portfolio again with quiet precision. Fletcher glanced once more toward the phones pointed at them from every direction. The officer understood now that the moment had already become public whether anyone intended it or not. Adrian shifted his hand slightly on the roof of the Lamborghini, feeling the cool metal under his palm. The car itself had become almost symbolic now. It was no longer just an object in the story. It was the spark that had revealed something deeper. Benton looked around the parking lot again, taking in the size of the crowd and the quiet focus of everyone watching. The chief knew the next words spoken would define the outcome of the entire situation. Adrian spoke first. Chief Benton, he said calmly. You asked earlier what accountability might look like tonight. Benton nodded slowly. Yes. Adrian looked directly at him and said quietly, that depends on whether this department is willing to acknowledge what actually happened here. The words hung in the air again, steady and deliberate. The crowd fell silent once more. The patrol lights continued to flash, but the authority they represented now felt balanced against something equally powerful standing beside the Lamborghini. Benton studied Adrian carefully, recognizing that the moment had reached a turning point. The next decision would determine whether this situation faded quietly into the evening or became a story far larger than anyone in the parking lot had expected when the patrol car first arrived. The parking lot felt different now, as if the evening air itself had thickened with expectation. Adrian Cole's words about accountability still hovered over the scene like a quiet line drawn in the pavement. The flashing patrol lights continued to sweep across the black Lamborghini Aventador, across the polished windows of the nearby stores, across the faces of the crowd that had grown into a small ring of silent witnesses. Chief Charles Benton stood a few steps from Adrian, his posture still controlled, but noticeably more cautious than when he first arrived. Officer Ryan Fletcher remained beside the patrol cruiser, his earlier confidence replaced by a restless stillness. The moment had moved beyond routine procedure, and everyone present understood it. Adrian did not rush the silence. He had learned long ago that the most powerful moments were rarely the loudest ones. Instead, he rested his hand lightly on the smooth curve of the Lamborghini's roof and watched the chief carefully. Daniel Harper stood quietly behind him with the leather portfolio closed again beneath his arm. The assistant holding the tablet had stepped slightly to the side, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly across her face as she continued monitoring documents and messages that had begun arriving from elsewhere. The teenager recording the scene whispered to someone beside him that the live video now had hundreds of viewers. Another person said the same video had already been shared across several local social media pages. The parking lot had become more than a location. It had become a stage. Benton finally exhaled slowly and stepped forward half a pace. Mr. Cole, he said carefully, no one here intends for misunderstandings to escalate into public controversy. Adrian's expression remained calm. Controversy usually begins when people refuse to acknowledge what happened, he replied quietly. The chief held his gaze for a moment longer before glancing briefly toward Officer Fletcher. Fletcher looked back, uncertain whether the chief expected him to speak or remain silent. Benton turned his attention back to Adrian. "What exactly are you asking from us tonight?" he said. Adrian tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question even though the answer had already formed in his mind. "Clarity," he said. Benton raised an eyebrow. "Clarity?" Adrian nodded once. "The situation began with a claim that the vehicle was stolen." Benton nodded slowly. "Yes." Adrian continued calmly. "That claim was proven incorrect." Benton nodded again. "Correct." Adrian's voice remained steady. But the conversation that followed was not about the vehicle. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Several people who had been present earlier understood exactly what he meant. Benton remained silent for a moment before responding. "You are referring to my earlier comment." Adrian did not look away. "Yes." The chief rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The evening sky had begun to deepen into a soft blue behind the glass towers of the plaza. The lights from the nearby restaurants cast warm reflections across the pavement. Benton seemed to weigh his next words carefully before speaking. "In the course of responding to incidents," he said slowly, "officers sometimes speak too quickly." Adrian considered the statement. Speaking too quickly reveals what people assume before they think. Harper spoke quietly beside him. And assumptions are what lead situations like this to unfold the way they did. Fletcher shifted again, clearly uncomfortable hearing the conversation dissect the moment he had witnessed from the beginning. Benton noticed the growing number of phones still pointed toward them and seemed to realize that whatever happened next would likely be replayed many times. The chief straightened slightly. "Mr. Cole," he said, "if my earlier statement suggested anything inappropriate, that was not the intention." Adrian watched him carefully. Intent and impact are different things. Benton nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. "Yes," he said quietly. The crowd remained silent now, listening to every word. Adrian did not press the moment aggressively. Instead, he let the chief sit with the realization that the situation had moved beyond simple explanation. The patrol lights continued flashing behind them, but their presence no longer controlled the atmosphere. The attention of the crowd had shifted completely to the conversation unfolding beside the Lamborghini. Benton spoke again after a long pause. "Mr. Cole," he said, "you have built a significant company in this city." Adrian nodded slightly. "Yes." Benton continued. "Your partnership with the municipal fleet program has benefited several departments." Adrian acknowledged the statement with another small nod. "That was the intention." The chief looked briefly toward the police cruiser again, then back to Adrian. "Our department values those partnerships." Adrian remained calm. "Partnerships are built on trust." Benton seemed to understand the weight of the sentence immediately. "And tonight may have damaged that trust." Adrian did not answer right away. The silence stretched just long enough for the crowd to feel the gravity of the moment. Finally he spoke. "Trust is not broken by a single mistake," he said quietly. Benton watched him closely. Adrian continued. "It is broken when mistakes are ignored." Harper nodded subtly beside him. Fletcher glanced toward the crowd again, aware that the entire exchange was still being recorded. The officer's shoulders seemed heavier now, as though he had begun replaying the earlier moments in his mind. Benton finally took a slow breath and addressed Adrian directly. "Then let us acknowledge the mistake," he said. Adrian remained still. The chief's voice carried across the parking lot clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Earlier this evening," Benton said, "I made a statement that implied you did not belong in a vehicle like the one beside you." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. The chief continued before the moment could fracture. "That statement should not have been made." The words settled into the air with surprising clarity. Adrian studied Benton carefully. The apology had not been dramatic, but it had been direct. Benton continued speaking. "I allowed an assumption to shape my response before all the information was clear." Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. The tension in the crowd softened slightly as people realized what was happening. The chief was acknowledging the moment openly. Benton finished the thought quietly. "For that, I apologize." The parking lot remained silent again, but the silence now carried relief rather than tension. Adrian looked at the chief for several seconds before answering. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward accountability," he said. Benton nodded slowly. Fletcher looked between them, the pressure in his posture easing slightly. Harper closed the portfolio with a soft motion. The assistant lowered the tablet screen. Adrian glanced once more at the Lamborghini beside him, its glossy surface reflecting the entire scene like a dark mirror. Then he looked back at Benton and said calmly, "What happens after acknowledgement is what determines whether the lesson lasts." The chief studied him carefully, realizing that the evening was not finished yet. The crowd sensed it as well. Even though the apology had shifted the atmosphere, everyone present could feel that the moment had not fully reached its conclusion. And as the patrol lights continued to rotate slowly across the pavement and the city lights began to glow around the plaza, the conversation between the chief and the man beside the Lamborghini moved quietly toward the next decision that would determine how the entire story would end. The apology lingered in the evening air, quiet but unmistakable. For the first time since the patrol lights had appeared in the parking lot, the tension around the black Lamborghini began to shift into something calmer, though the moment still carried weight. Adrian Colt did not react immediately. He stood beside the car with the same composed posture he had maintained from the beginning, his hand resting lightly on the smooth roof as if grounding himself in the moment. The reflections of the flashing lights slid slowly across the glossy surface, catching the edges of the Lamborghini's sharp lines and reflecting them across the pavement. The crowd remained still, their phones raised, their attention locked on what would happen next. Chief Charles Benton watched Adrian carefully, waiting for a response. The chief's words had been direct and public, and everyone present understood that apologies in moments like this rarely happened without reason. Officer Ryan Fletcher stood several feet away near the patrol cruiser, his shoulders tense but no longer defensive. The assistant holding the tablet lowered the screen slightly, while Daniel Harper remained calm beside Adrian, the leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. Adrian finally spoke after several seconds of silence. His voice was calm and measured. "An apology matters," he said quietly. "But the real question is what it leads to." The sentence settled across the crowd like a gentle ripple. Benton nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. "That is fair," he said. The evening sky above the plaza had deepened into a darker shade of blue now, and the warm lights from the nearby restaurants cast soft reflections across the parking lot. More people had gathered along the edges of the sidewalk. Some had arrived after hearing about the live video circulating online. The teenager with the baseball cap continued recording, his phone angled steadily toward Adrian and the chief. Adrian looked briefly toward the surrounding crowd before returning his attention to Benton. "This moment is being watched," he said. Benton glanced toward the phones pointed in their direction and nodded once. "Yes," he replied. Adrian continued calmly. "That means the way it ends will matter more than the way it started." Harper added quietly beside him, "Public trust is shaped by how institutions respond to moments like this." Benton took a slow breath, clearly aware of the truth in those words. The chief had spent years working in public service, and he understood that perception could change quickly when a moment unfolded in front of witnesses. Adrian remained composed, his posture steady. He was not raising his voice or pushing the moment aggressively. Instead, he allowed the weight of the situation to speak for itself. Benton studied him carefully. "Mr. Cole," the chief said, "you have every reason to feel frustrated." Adrian shook his head slightly. "Frustration does not solve problems," he replied. The calmness of the statement caused several people in the crowd to exchange quiet glances. The situation had begun with suspicion and authority, but the tone of the conversation now felt more reflective than confrontational. Fletcher watched the exchange carefully. The officer seemed to be replaying the earlier moments in his mind. The initial report, the arrival at the scene, the assumption that had shaped the first interaction. Benton spoke again. "You mentioned accountability earlier," he said. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." The chief paused briefly before continuing. "In practical terms, what does that mean to you?" Adrian considered the question. The parking lot remained silent as he gathered his thoughts. Finally he spoke. "Accountability begins with recognition," he said. Benton listened without interrupting. Adrian continued calmly. "Not just recognizing that a mistake happened, but recognizing why it happened." A few people in the crowd nodded subtly as though they understood exactly what he meant. Benton looked thoughtful. "You believe the assumption that led to this situation needs to be addressed?" Adrian met his gaze. "Yes." Harper added quietly. "Because if the reason is not understood, the mistake will simply repeat itself." The chief folded his arms again, considering the point carefully. The flashing patrol lights continued to sweep slowly across the pavement behind them. The sound of distant traffic drifted through the air as evening settled over the plaza. Adrian spoke again, his voice steady. "Tonight is not only about me." Benton raised an eyebrow slightly. Adrian gestured subtly toward the crowd surrounding them. "It is about everyone watching this moment." Several bystanders shifted slightly as they realized they had been included in the statement. Adrian continued. "Every person here understands what it feels like to be judged before being understood." The crowd remained quiet, but the truth of the words hung in the air. Benton nodded slowly. "That is a fair point," he said. Adrian rested both hands lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini again, looking briefly at the reflection of the patrol lights moving across the polished surface. Then he returned his gaze to the chief. "I built my company by learning how to solve problems," he said. Benton listened carefully. Adrian continued. "The best solutions are the ones that prevent the same problem from happening again." Fletcher shifted slightly near the cruiser, clearly aware that the conversation had moved beyond the initial report entirely. Benton asked another question quietly. "And how would you prevent something like this from happening again?" Adrian paused for a moment before answering. The crowd leaned forward slightly, curious about his response. "Training," he said. Benton tilted his head. "Training." Adrian nodded. "Moments like this are rarely about one person," he explained. "They are about patterns." Harper nodded beside him. "Patterns can only change when people understand them." Benton absorbed the idea in silence for several seconds. The chief had spent years in leadership, and he understood that systemic change often began with simple conversations that revealed deeper issues. Adrian spoke again. "Your department protects this." "City," he said. Benton nodded. "Yes." Adrian continued calmly. "But protection requires trust." The statement lingered for a moment. Benton looked around at the crowd once more, the phone still recording, the quiet attention of the bystanders. Then he looked back at Adrian. "You believe tonight can become something constructive," he said. Adrian nodded. "Yes." The chief considered the idea carefully. Fletcher watched him with cautious curiosity, unsure what the next step would be. Adrian remained calm, waiting without pressure. Finally Benton spoke again. "Mr. Cole," he said, "if we were to address this through training and discussion within the department, would that satisfy the accountability you mentioned?" Adrian looked at him thoughtfully before answering. "It would be a beginning," he said. Benton nodded slowly. The chief seemed relieved to see a path forward emerging from what had begun as a tense confrontation. The crowd sensed the shift as well. The earlier tension in the parking lot softened slightly, replaced by the feeling that something meaningful might actually come from the moment. Adrian glanced toward the Lamborghini again before speaking one more time. "Moments like this can divide people," he said quietly. Benton listened carefully. Adrian finished the thought with calm clarity. "Or they can teach people." The evening air felt lighter as the words settled across the plaza. The patrol lights continued to flash softly behind them, but their presence no longer carried the same tension as before. Instead, they illuminated a moment that had transformed from accusation into reflection. And as the crowd watched the conversation between the chief and the man beside the Lamborghini continue to unfold, it became clear that the outcome of this night might reach far beyond the parking lot where it began. The evening had settled fully over the plaza now, and the bright white lights from the storefronts illuminated the parking lot where the moment continued to unfold. The flashing red and blue reflections from the patrol cruiser still rotated across the glossy black Lamborghini Aventador, but the tension that had once defined the scene had softened into something quieter and more reflective. Adrian Cole stood beside the car with the same composed posture he had maintained from the beginning, his presence calm and grounded as though the entire evening had become an unexpected conversation rather than a confrontation. The crowd surrounding the scene remained larger than before, a ring of silent witnesses with phones raised, their attention fixed on every word spoken between Adrian and Chief Charles Benton. Officer Ryan Fletcher remained near the cruiser, his shoulders slightly lowered now as he listened to the exchange. Daniel Harper stood beside Adrian, the leather portfolio resting against his side, while the assistant with the tablet continued quietly reviewing information that occasionally lit the screen with a soft glow. The atmosphere felt different now, as though the parking lot had transformed from a place of accusation into a place of reflection. Chief Benton looked at Adrian carefully before speaking again. Training is something we can discuss, he said. Adrian nodded once. It is a start, he replied calmly. Benton glanced briefly toward the crowd, clearly aware that every word spoken here would likely travel far beyond the parking lot. The chief returned his gaze to Adrian. You said moments like this come from patterns, Benton said. Adrian acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. Yes. The chief continued thoughtfully. Patterns can be difficult to see when you are inside the system that created them. Adrian listened carefully, then answered with quiet clarity. That is why moments like this matter. The words carried across the crowd like a calm ripple. A few people nodded as though they understood the deeper meaning behind the conversation. The teenager still recording shifted his stance slightly, but kept the camera steady. The glow of the phone screen reflected faintly in his eyes. Adrian rested his hand on the Lamborghini again, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm as the evening breeze moved gently across the plaza. For a moment he did not speak, and the silence gave the crowd time to absorb what had already been said. Then Adrian continued. When I was younger, he said calmly, I experienced moments like this in very different circumstances. Benton watched him closely. Adrian's voice remained steady as he spoke. I remember standing outside a dealership when I was 19 years old. The crowd remained silent, listening carefully. Adrian continued slowly. I was wearing a suit I had saved months to buy. The lights from the storefronts reflected softly across the pavement as he spoke. I walked into the showroom with the intention of asking questions about how the business worked. Fletcher glanced toward Adrian with quiet curiosity. Adrian continued. The man at the front desk assumed I was in the wrong place before I said a single word. The statement was not angry. It was simply factual. The crowd remained still, absorbing the memory he was sharing. Adrian's gaze remained calm as he continued. He asked if I was there to clean the floors. A few people in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable looks. Benton listened without interrupting. Adrian continued quietly. I told him I was there to learn. The reflection of the patrol lights moved slowly across the Lamborghini as the moment unfolded. Adrian spoke with the same calm voice. That day I made a decision. Benton asked softly, What decision? Adrian looked toward the car beside him before answering. I decided I would understand the business better than anyone who doubted I belonged there. The sentence settled across the crowd like a quiet turning point. Harper watched Adrian with a faint nod of respect. Adrian continued. It took years. The crowd remained silent. Long nights studying the industry, learning how dealerships worked, understanding financing, supply chains, manufacturing partnerships. Benton listened carefully as Adrian described the path that had brought him to the moment unfolding in the parking lot. Adrian continued speaking calmly. Eventually, I opened my first dealership. Fletcher raised his eyebrows slightly. Adrian continued. Then another. The assistant with the tablet looked up briefly as though she had heard the story before, but still appreciated its meaning. Adrian finished the thought quietly. And eventually the company you now know as Cole Automotive Holdings. A murmur of recognition moved through the crowd again. Several bystanders had already searched the company name earlier, and hearing the story behind it made the moment feel even more significant. Benton spoke quietly after a few seconds of silence. That must have taken extraordinary persistence. Adrian nodded slightly. It required patience. Benton considered the story carefully before responding. So when you say moments like tonight matter, he said, you are speaking from experience. Adrian nodded once. Yes. The evening air felt calm now, almost thoughtful, as though the entire crowd had become part of a conversation larger than the situation that began it. Fletcher looked down briefly at the pavement, clearly reflecting on the story he had just heard. Harper remained silent beside Adrian, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Benton finally spoke again. Mr. Cole, he said, what happened tonight does not represent the values we aim to uphold as a department. Adrian, listen without interrupting. Benton continued. But hearing your story makes it clear why moments like this carry weight. Adrian nodded slowly. Every person carries experiences others cannot see. The chief looked around the parking lot again, taking in the faces of the people who had gathered to witness the scene. Some looked thoughtful. Others looked reflective. Benton turned back to Adrian. If we create training based on conversations like this, he said, would you be willing to participate in that discussion? Adrian considered the question for a moment. The crowd waited quietly. Finally he answered, "Yes." Benton nodded once, clearly relieved by the answer. Adrian continued speaking calmly. "Because change happens when people are willing to listen." The sentence carried across the plaza with quiet clarity. The patrol lights continued to rotate behind them, but the atmosphere no longer felt tense. Instead, it felt like a moment that had transformed from misunderstanding into understanding. Adrian glanced toward the Lamborghini again, its polished surface reflecting the lights and the people standing around it. Then he looked back at Benton and said quietly, "The goal is not to win moments like this." Benton listened closely. Adrian finished the thought with calm certainty. "The goal is to make sure they happen less often." The crowd remained silent as the meaning of those words settled into the night air. And as the lights from the surrounding buildings illuminated the parking lot where the conversation had unfolded, it became clear that the evening had changed something more important than a misunderstanding about a car. It had opened a conversation about perception, trust, and the quiet power of patience in moments when assumptions might otherwise have shaped the story. The parking lot had grown quieter as the evening settled into night, but the attention surrounding Adrian Cole had not faded. The lights from the storefronts glowed warmly across the pavement, and the patrol cruiser's rotating lights still cast slow flashes of red and blue across the sleek black Lamborghini Aventador. Yet the atmosphere now felt more like a gathering than a confrontation. The crowd remained in place, watching the conversation unfold with a mixture of curiosity and reflection. Adrian stood beside the car with calm patience, the same steady posture that had guided every moment since the officers first arrived. Chief Charles Benton faced him with a thoughtful expression, clearly aware that the story unfolding here had already moved beyond the original report about a vehicle. Officer Ryan Fletcher remained near the cruiser, quieter than before, his attention focused on the exchange between the chief and the man beside the Lamborghini. Daniel Harper stood calmly at Adrian's side, with the leather portfolio resting against his leg, while the assistant holding the tablet checked incoming messages that occasionally illuminated her screen. Adrian's earlier story about his first visit to a dealership still lingered in the minds of many who had heard it. The memory of a young man walking into a showroom and being mistaken for someone who did not belong there had given the entire evening a deeper context. Chief Benton spoke again after a few moments of silence. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "your story explains a great deal about why tonight matters to you." Adrian nodded once. "It does." Benton looked around the parking lot briefly, taking in the faces of the people gathered there. Some looked thoughtful. Others appeared quietly moved by what they had heard. The chief returned his attention to Adrian. "Many people in this city know the name of your company," Benton said, "but they may not know the story behind it." Adrian rested his hand lightly on the Lamborghini again, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm as the evening breeze moved through the plaza. "Most companies have stories like that," he said calmly. Benton raised an eyebrow slightly. "Stories about determination?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Stories about learning how to respond when people underestimate you." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. The sentence resonated with many of the people listening. Harper glanced briefly at Adrian with a subtle expression of respect. The assistant holding the tablet lowered the device slightly, listening to the conversation as well. Benton spoke again. "It seems you turned those experiences into motivation." Adrian nodded. "Yes." The chief studied him for a moment. "And tonight reminded you of those earlier moments." Adrian's voice remained steady. "Yes." The patrol lights continued to flash softly behind them. Fletcher shifted slightly near the cruiser, listening closely now. The officer had arrived expecting a routine investigation. Instead, he had become part of a conversation about perception, leadership, and responsibility. Adrian looked briefly toward the surrounding crowd before continuing. "The difference between then and now," he said quietly, "is that tonight people are watching." Benton nodded slowly. "Yes." Adrian gestured subtly toward the phone still recording the scene. "And that means moments like this have the power to teach something." The chief considered the idea carefully. "You believe this moment can be constructive," Benton said. Adrian nodded. "Yes." The crowd remained silent as the conversation unfolded. A woman near the front lowered her phone slightly, but continued watching with interest. The teenager recording adjusted his stance, but kept the camera focused. Harper spoke softly beside Adrian. "Public conversations like this can lead to meaningful change if people are willing to learn from them. Benton acknowledged the point with a small nod. The chief had spent years navigating complex situations within the city. He understood that moments of tension could either divide communities or open the door to progress depending on how they were handled. Adrian spoke again after a moment of silence. "When I built my company," he said, "I learned that leadership requires listening as much as speaking." Benton listened carefully. Adrian continued calmly. "That lesson applies everywhere." Fletcher glanced toward the chief again, recognizing the direction the conversation had taken. The earlier tension between authority and accusation had transformed into something far more reflective. Benton finally spoke again. "Mr. Cole," he said, "if there is one lesson you would want people watching this moment to remember, what would it be?" Adrian considered the question carefully. The crowd leaned forward slightly, curious about his answer. The evening breeze moved gently across the plaza again, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and conversation from the nearby restaurants. Adrian spoke slowly. "Do not assume you know someone's story just by looking at them." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The crowd remained quiet as the sentence settled across the parking lot. Benton nodded thoughtfully. "That is a powerful reminder," he said. Adrian continued calmly. "Every person you meet has a history you cannot see." Fletcher lowered his gaze slightly, reflecting on the statement. Harper nodded quietly beside Adrian. Benton spoke again. "And the responsibility of leadership is to recognize that," he said. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." The chief looked around the parking lot once more, observing the people who had gathered to witness the conversation. The atmosphere felt calm now, almost thoughtful. What had begun with suspicion had turned into a discussion about respect and understanding. Benton returned his attention to Adrian. "Mr. Cole," he said, "tonight could have unfolded very differently." Adrian acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. "Yes." Benton continued. "But your response turned it into something constructive." Adrian smiled faintly again. "Sometimes patience is more powerful than confrontation." The crowd reacted with soft murmurs of agreement. Fletcher glanced toward the Lamborghini once more, then back toward Adrian. The officer appeared to understand that the moment had changed his own perspective as well. Adrian looked briefly toward the car beside him, its polished surface reflecting the lights of the plaza and the people gathered around it. Then he returned his attention to the chief. "Moments like this are not about proving someone wrong," he said calmly. Benton listened carefully. Adrian finished the thought with quiet clarity. "They are about helping people see something they might not have noticed before." The sentence lingered in the evening air as the lights from the surrounding buildings illuminated the parking lot. The crowd remained still, absorbing the words. And as the conversation between the chief and the man beside the Lamborghini continued under the soft glow of the city lights, it became clear that the lesson from this night would extend far beyond the car that had first brought everyone together. The night air had grown cooler across the plaza, and the glow of the surrounding storefront lights now reflected clearly across the polished black Lamborghini Aventador. The flashing patrol lights from the cruiser behind it continued to sweep slowly across the pavement, but the atmosphere that had once carried tension now felt thoughtful and steady. The crowd that had gathered earlier remained in place, though their posture had changed. They were no longer leaning forward with curiosity about a confrontation. Instead, they stood quietly, listening to the conversation unfolding between Adrian Cole and Chief Charles Benton. Adrian remained beside the Lamborghini with calm composure, his presence grounded and unhurried, as if the moment had become something larger than the misunderstanding that began it. Daniel Harper stood a few steps behind him with the leather portfolio resting against his leg. The assistant with the tablet remained nearby, occasionally glancing at the screen as new notifications appeared. Officer Ryan Fletcher stood beside the patrol cruiser, his attention focused entirely on the exchange now taking place. Chief Benton looked around the parking lot briefly before speaking again. The chief had clearly recognized that the moment had grown beyond the initial report, and had become something that carried meaning for everyone watching. "Mr. Cole," Benton said carefully, "the point you made about not assuming someone's story is an important one." Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Benton continued. "Many people watching tonight will remember that lesson." Adrian rested his hand lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini again. The polished surface reflected the lights of the plaza and the faces of the people gathered around them. That would make the moment worthwhile, he said quietly. The chief studied him thoughtfully. Your response tonight showed remarkable restraint, Benton said. Adrian smiled faintly. Experience teaches patience. A few people in the crowd nodded quietly as though they understood exactly what he meant. Harper remained silent beside Adrian, his expression calm but observant. Fletcher shifted slightly near the cruiser, clearly reflecting on the conversation as well. Benton spoke again after a short pause. You mentioned earlier that leadership requires listening, the chief said. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Benton folded his arms thoughtfully. That applies to law enforcement as well, he added. Adrian acknowledged the statement. It applies to anyone responsible for serving a community. The evening breeze moved softly across the plaza, carrying distant sounds of traffic and conversation from the nearby restaurants. The lights inside the shops reflected across the windows, creating a calm atmosphere that felt almost reflective. The teenager who had been recording from the beginning still held his phone steady, though the tension in his posture had softened. He whispered quietly to someone beside him that the moment had turned into something far more meaningful than he expected. Benton glanced toward the crowd again before returning his attention to Adrian. Mr. Cole, he said, I want to make something clear. Adrian listened without interrupting. Benton continued carefully. Our department's responsibility is to protect every person in this city. Adrian nodded slowly. That responsibility is important. The chief looked directly at him. And when we fail to live up to that responsibility, we must learn from it. Adrian met his gaze calmly. Learning is the only way forward. Fletcher lowered his eyes briefly, clearly absorbing the weight of the conversation. Harper spoke quietly beside Adrian. Institutions grow stronger when they are willing to examine moments like this honestly. Benton nodded once in agreement. The chief had clearly reached the point where he understood that the lesson from the evening extended beyond a single misunderstanding. About a vehicle, Adrian spoke again after a moment of silence. What matters now is what happens after tonight, he said. Benton raised an eyebrow slightly. Meaning? Adrian gestured subtly toward the police cruiser behind them. Moments like this can either be forgotten or they can become part of something better. The words carried across the crowd with calm clarity. Several bystanders nodded quietly. Benton considered the statement carefully. You believe this moment should lead to change, the chief said. Adrian nodded once. Yes. The patrol lights continued to flash softly behind them, reflecting across the Lamborghini's glossy surface like slow pulses of color. The scene felt almost symbolic now. What had begun as a moment of suspicion had transformed into a discussion about responsibility and understanding. Benton spoke again after several seconds of thought. Mr. Cole, he said, I will ensure that tonight's conversation becomes part of a larger discussion within the department. Adrian listened carefully. Benton continued. We will review the training programs we use for officers interacting with the public. Adrian nodded slightly. That would be a meaningful step. Fletcher looked toward the chief, surprised but clearly respectful of the decision. The officer seemed to understand that the evening had revealed something that could not simply be ignored. Harper closed the portfolio quietly, signaling that the situation had reached a new phase. Adrian looked briefly toward the Lamborghini again before speaking once more. When people see moments like this, he said calmly, they often expect anger. Benton listened closely. Adrian continued. But anger rarely changes anything. The crowd remained silent as the sentence settled into the night air. Adrian finished the thought with steady clarity. Understanding does. Benton nodded slowly. I agree. The chief glanced around the parking lot again, observing the people who had stayed to witness the entire conversation. Some looked thoughtful. Others appeared quietly inspired by the calm way the moment had unfolded. Fletcher finally spoke after remaining silent for so long. His voice was careful. Mr. Cole, he said, I appreciate the way you handled this tonight. Adrian looked at him with calm acknowledgement. Thank you, Officer Fletcher. The simple exchange seemed to ease some of the remaining tension that had lingered in the air. Benton watched the interaction and nodded once more. The chief's voice carried quiet authority as he spoke again. This moment could have become something negative, he said. Adrian listened. Benton continued. Instead, it became an opportunity to learn. Adrian smiled faintly again. Those are the moments that matter most. The crowd remained still as the conversation settled into a quiet pause. The patrol lights continued flashing softly behind the officers, reflecting across the pavement and the polished curves of the Lamborghini. Adrian looked across the parking lot one last time before returning his attention to Benton. "People remember how moments like this end," he said calmly. Benton nodded. "Yes." Adrian finished the thought with quiet certainty. "So let this one end with understanding." The words lingered in the evening air as the lights of the plaza illuminated the scene around them. And as the conversation between the chief and the man beside the Lamborghini reached its calm turning point, everyone present could sense that the story of the night would not be remembered as a confrontation about a car, but as a reminder of how patience and honesty could transform a misunderstanding into something far more meaningful. The plaza had grown quieter as the evening continued, yet the sense that something important had taken place still lingered in the air. The warm glow from the storefronts reflected across the polished pavement, and the sleek black Lamborghini Aventador stood at the center of the scene like a silent witness to everything that had unfolded. The flashing patrol lights from the cruiser had slowed, their red and blue reflections drifting across the car's glossy surface in calm pulses. Adrian Cole remained beside the vehicle with the same steady posture he had carried from the beginning. His hand rested lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini, as if grounding the moment in quiet patience. Around him the crowd had begun to relax slightly, but no one had left. People remained where they stood because they sensed that the final meaning of the evening had not yet fully revealed itself. Chief Charles Benton looked around the plaza once more before returning his attention to Adrian. The chief's expression was thoughtful now, shaped by everything that had been said. Officer Ryan Fletcher stood near the cruiser with a calmer posture than before, his attention fixed on the conversation between Adrian and the chief. Daniel Harper remained composed beside Adrian, the leather portfolio tucked under his arm, while the assistant holding the tablet continued observing the scene quietly. The atmosphere felt reflective, almost as if the entire plaza had become a place of quiet learning rather than confrontation. Benton finally spoke again. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "I believe you are right about how moments like this are remembered." Adrian nodded slightly. "People remember the ending," he replied calmly. Benton looked toward the small crowd that had gathered around them. Some people had lowered their phones now, though many still recorded quietly. The chief understood that the moment had become part of the public conversation, whether anyone had intended it or not. "This evening began with uncertainty," Benton continued. Adrian listened without interrupting. Benton went on. "But the way it ends will shape how people understand it." Adrian acknowledged the statement with a small nod. The cool evening breeze moved gently across the plaza, carrying the distant sounds of the city settling into night. Adrian glanced briefly at the Lamborghini beside him, its polished surface reflecting the lights of the plaza and the faces of the people who had stayed to witness the entire exchange. Then he returned his attention to the chief. "Every moment teaches something," he said quietly. Benton considered the words before responding. "And tonight has taught several lessons," the chief replied. Fletcher shifted slightly near the cruiser as if recognizing that he had learned something from the experience as well. Harper spoke quietly beside Adrian. "Leadership is measured by how people respond when they realize they were wrong." Benton nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. Adrian's voice remained calm as he spoke again. "What matters most now is that the lesson continues beyond tonight." The chief folded his arms thoughtfully. "You believe this moment should be remembered as the beginning of change," he said. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Benton looked toward the patrol cruiser again, then back toward the Lamborghini, then finally toward Adrian. "Then, that is how it will be remembered," he said. The quiet certainty in his voice carried across the crowd. A few people nodded as though they appreciated the direction the moment had taken. Fletcher looked toward Adrian with a thoughtful expression. The officer appeared to understand that the evening had revealed something important about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform he carried. Adrian noticed the expression and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. The exchange was simple, but it carried meaning. The assistant with the tablet lowered the device completely now, sensing that the moment had reached its closing chapter. Benton spoke again after a short pause. "Mr. Cole," he said, "tonight reminded all of us that respect must be present before judgment." Adrian smiled faintly. Respect allows people to see clearly. The crowd remained quiet as the conversation unfolded. Several people who had been standing near the edge of the plaza began whispering softly among themselves about what they had witnessed. Some spoke about the calm way Adrian had handled the situation. Others spoke about the chief's willingness to acknowledge the mistake publicly. Adrian looked around the parking lot one more time. The lights from the shops reflected across the windows, and the night sky above the plaza had grown darker. The moment that had begun with flashing patrol lights and suspicion now felt completely different. Adrian turned back to Benton. "Moments like this reveal character," he said calmly. Benton listened carefully. Adrian continued, "Not only the character of individuals, but the character of institutions." Benton nodded slowly. "That is true." Fletcher lowered his gaze briefly again, clearly reflecting on the statement. Harper remained quiet, allowing the words to settle into the atmosphere around them. Adrian spoke again after a moment of silence. "You chose to acknowledge the mistake," he said to Benton. The chief did not interrupt. Adrian finished the thought with steady clarity. "That decision matters more than the mistake itself." The crowd reacted with soft murmurs of agreement. Benton nodded once in acknowledgement. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. Adrian glanced again at the Lamborghini, then back toward the chief. "This car was never the real issue tonight," he said. Benton understood immediately. "The issue was perception," the chief replied. Adrian nodded. "Yes." The conversation paused for a moment as both men absorbed the meaning of the evening. Fletcher finally spoke again with a respectful tone. "Mr. Cole," he said, "thank you for showing patience tonight." Adrian looked toward him calmly. "Patience allows people to listen," he replied. The officer nodded slowly, clearly taking the lesson to heart. Benton looked across the plaza once more, then back at Adrian. "I believe this moment will stay with everyone who witnessed it," he said. Adrian smiled faintly again. "That is the hope." The lights from the patrol cruiser continued to glow softly behind them, but the urgency they once carried had faded. The scene now felt peaceful, like the quiet closing of a chapter that had unexpectedly turned into a lesson. Adrian looked once more at the people gathered around them before speaking his final thought of the evening. "The most powerful response to misunderstanding is understanding itself," he said calmly. The words lingered in the night air as the plaza lights illuminated the final moments of the encounter. And as the crowd slowly began to realize that the evening had come to its natural conclusion, it became clear that the story people would remember was not about a car or a misunderstanding. It was about how dignity, patience, and honesty had transformed a moment of suspicion into a lesson that would travel far beyond the parking lot where it began. The night had fully settled over the plaza now, and the bright lights from the storefronts reflected across the polished pavement like calm pools of gold. The sleek black Lamborghini Aventador remained parked at the center of the moment, its glossy surface reflecting the surrounding lights, the patrol cruiser, and the faces of the people who had stayed to witness the conclusion of an unexpected evening. The flashing lights from the cruiser were no longer urgent. They moved slowly and quietly across the scene like fading echoes of the tension that had once filled the parking lot. Adrian Cole stood beside the car with the same calm composure that had guided every step of the conversation. His hand rested lightly against the smooth roof of the Lamborghini, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced many difficult moments and chosen patience each time. Around him the crowd had begun to shift slightly, though few people had left. They sensed that the final meaning of the evening was still unfolding. Chief Charles Benton stood facing Adrian, his expression thoughtful and reflective. The chief had entered the plaza earlier with authority and certainty, responding to a report about a missing vehicle. Now he stood in a very different moment, aware that the evening had transformed into something far more meaningful. Officer Ryan Fletcher remained near the patrol cruiser, watching quietly. His posture had changed as well. The tension that once defined his stance had softened into reflection. Daniel Harper stood calmly beside Adrian with the leather portfolio resting against his leg, while the assistant who had been holding the tablet now kept it lowered at her side. The entire plaza seemed to breathe more slowly now. Benton spoke again after several seconds of silence. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "this evening has given everyone here a great deal to think about." Adrian nodded slightly. "Moments like this often do." The chief glanced briefly at the crowd that had gathered around them. Some people had begun lowering their phones, but many still watched with quiet attention. Benton returned his gaze to Adrian. I want to thank you for the way you handled this situation, he said. Adrian smiled faintly. Patience is easier when the goal is understanding. A few people in the crowd nodded quietly at the remark. Benton continued speaking. You could have responded with anger. Adrian shook his head gently. Anger closes conversations. The chief considered the statement carefully. And tonight remained a conversation. Adrian nodded once. Yes. The evening breeze moved through the plaza again, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and quiet laughter from the nearby restaurants. The moment felt calm now, almost reflective, as though everyone present understood they had witnessed something unusual. Benton spoke again with quiet sincerity. Your story about the dealership stayed with me, he said. Adrian looked at him with calm interest. Benton continued. The idea that someone could be judged before speaking a single word is something we must work to prevent. Adrian nodded slowly. That is why the lesson matters. Fletcher glanced toward Adrian again, clearly recognizing that the evening had changed his own perspective as well. Harper spoke softly beside Adrian. Growth begins when people are willing to listen to experiences outside their own. Benton nodded once in agreement. Adrian rested both hands lightly on the Lamborghini now, looking briefly at the reflection of the lights moving across the car's polished surface. Then he looked back at the chief. Tonight will be remembered, he said calmly. Benton acknowledged the statement. Yes. Adrian continued. The only question is how it will be remembered. The crowd remained silent as the sentence settled into the night air. Benton spoke again after a moment of reflection. I believe it will be remembered as a moment when people chose understanding over assumption. Adrian smiled faintly. That would be a good outcome. Fletcher finally stepped forward slightly from the cruiser, his voice respectful. Mr. Cole, he said, I appreciate the patience you showed tonight. Adrian looked at him with calm acknowledgement. Thank you, officer. Fletcher. The officer nodded slowly, clearly carrying the lesson with him. Benton looked at both men for a moment before speaking again. Moments like this remind us that responsibility comes with authority, he said. Adrian agreed. Authority is meaningful only when it serves everyone fairly. The chief nodded once more. The crowd surrounding them began whispering quietly again, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Some spoke about the calm way Adrian had guided the conversation. Others spoke about the chief's willingness to acknowledge the mistake and turn the moment into a lesson. Adrian looked around the plaza once more, taking in the faces of the people who had stayed. The lights from the nearby restaurants cast warm reflections across the pavement, and the night sky above the buildings had grown deep and quiet. Adrian spoke again with steady calm. Moments like this can divide people, he said. Benton listened closely. Adrian continued. But they can also bring people together when everyone is willing to learn. The sentence settled gently into the air. Benton nodded slowly. I believe tonight has done exactly that. Adrian looked once more at the Lamborghini beside him, the car that had unknowingly sparked the entire conversation. Its sleek design reflected the lights and movement around it like a silent witness to the evening's lesson. Then Adrian returned his gaze to the chief. The real value of a moment like this, he said quietly, is what people take with them afterward. Benton understood immediately. And what people do with that understanding, he replied. Adrian nodded once. The crowd remained silent, absorbing the final exchange. Fletcher stepped back slightly toward the cruiser, his expression thoughtful. Harper closed the leather portfolio slowly, sensing that the evening had reached its natural ending. Adrian took a slow breath and looked across the plaza again before speaking his final thought. Every person deserves to be seen clearly, he said calmly. Benton listened carefully. Adrian finished the thought with quiet certainty. Not through assumptions, but through understanding. The words lingered in the cool night air as the plaza lights illuminated the final moments of the encounter. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, carrying the lesson of the evening with them, it became clear that what began as a misunderstanding beside a luxury car had transformed into something far more powerful. It had become a reminder that dignity, patience, and honest conversation could turn even the most unexpected moment into an opportunity for growth. The plaza had grown quieter as the last moments of the evening unfolded, yet the air still carried the weight of everything that had taken place. The lights from the surrounding storefronts cast warm reflections across the pavement, and the sleek black Lamborghini Aventador remained parked where it had been from the beginning, its polished surface reflecting the city lights like a mirror. The patrol cruiser behind it was no longer flashing with urgency. The red and blue lights had slowed and softened, their reflections drifting calmly across the car's curved body and the pavement beneath it. Adrian Cole stood beside the vehicle with the same composed posture that had guided him through the entire encounter. His hand rested lightly on the roof of the Lamborghini, and his expression carried a quiet calm that seemed to anchor the moment. Around him, the crowd that had gathered earlier was beginning to thin, though many people still lingered, unwilling to leave before witnessing the final exchange between Adrian and Chief Charles Benton. Benton stood facing Adrian with a thoughtful expression. The chief had arrived earlier responding to a report about a missing vehicle, expecting a routine investigation. Instead, he had found himself part of a moment that had turned into a conversation about perception, responsibility, and understanding. Officer Ryan Fletcher remained near the patrol cruiser, his posture more relaxed now, but his attention still focused on the conversation. Daniel Harper stood quietly beside Adrian with the leather portfolio resting against his leg, while the assistant who had been holding the tablet watched calmly from a step behind them. The evening breeze moved gently through the plaza, carrying the quiet sounds of the city settling into night. Benton finally spoke again. "Mr. Cole," he said slowly, "tonight did not unfold the way any of us expected." Adrian nodded slightly. "Most meaningful moments do not." The chief allowed a faint smile to appear before continuing. "But I believe this moment will be remembered for the right reasons." Adrian looked around the plaza briefly, taking in the faces of the people who had stayed to witness the end of the story. Then he returned his attention to Benton. "That depends on what people choose to learn from it," he said calmly. Benton nodded once. "I intend to make sure the lesson continues." The statement carried quiet determination. Fletcher listened carefully, understanding that the chief meant the department would move forward differently after the events of the evening. Adrian acknowledged the commitment with a small nod. "Then tonight has already achieved something important." The crowd remained quiet as the conversation continued. Several bystanders had begun whispering softly among themselves, reflecting on what they had witnessed. A few people still held their phones up, though the urgency to record had faded. The moment had become less about capturing drama and more about remembering the lesson it carried. Harper spoke quietly beside Adrian. "Moments like this remind people that dignity and patience are powerful tools." Benton nodded thoughtfully. "They are." Adrian rested both hands lightly on the Lamborghini now, feeling the cool surface beneath his palms. The car had become almost symbolic during the evening, not because of its value or appearance, but because it had been the spark that revealed something deeper. Adrian looked at the car for a moment before speaking again. "This vehicle was simply the beginning of the conversation," he said. Benton understood immediately. "The real conversation was about how people see each other," the chief replied. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Fletcher shifted slightly near the cruiser, clearly absorbing the meaning of the exchange. The officer had arrived earlier with confidence that he understood the situation. Now he understood that the lesson from the evening would stay with him long after the patrol lights turned off. Benton spoke again. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate the way you chose to handle this moment," he said sincerely. Adrian smiled faintly. "Respect opens more doors than confrontation." The chief nodded slowly. "That is a lesson every leader should remember." Adrian looked toward the crowd once more. The number of people remaining in the plaza had grown smaller, but those who stayed seemed deeply attentive to the final words being spoken. Adrian spoke calmly. "Leadership is not about proving power," he said. Benton listened carefully. Adrian continued. "It is about showing people what respect looks like." The words settled gently into the night air. Several people in the crowd nodded quietly, recognizing the truth of the statement. Harper closed the leather portfolio slowly, signaling that the moment had reached its natural conclusion. The assistant beside him lowered the tablet completely. Benton looked around the plaza one last time before returning his gaze to Adrian. "I believe tonight will be remembered as a turning point," he said. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Turning points are defined by what happens next." Benton nodded. "And what happens next is up to us." Fletcher stepped forward slightly and offered a respectful nod toward Adrian. "Thank you for the lesson tonight," the officer said quietly. Adrian acknowledged the gesture with calm respect. Lessons belong to everyone willing to hear them. The patrol lights behind them finally dimmed completely as the cruiser's engine settled into a quiet idle. The sudden absence of the flashing colors made the plaza feel even calmer. Adrian looked once more at the Lamborghini, then back toward the chief. Moments like this remind us that justice does not always arrive through force, he said calmly. Benton listened closely. Adrian finished the thought with quiet certainty. Sometimes it arrives through clarity. The words lingered softly in the night air. Benton extended his hand. Adrian accepted the handshake without hesitation. The gesture was simple, but it carried the meaning of everything that had unfolded during the evening. The crowd began to disperse slowly after that, people walking away with thoughtful expressions as they carried the story with them. Some spoke quietly about the calm dignity Adrian had shown. Others spoke about the chief's willingness to acknowledge the mistake and learn from it. Adrian stepped back beside the Lamborghini as the plaza gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The city lights reflected across the car's polished surface as if nothing unusual had ever happened. But for those who had been present, the moment would remain unforgettable. Adrian opened the driver's door and paused for one final glance across the plaza before sitting inside. The engine started with a quiet hum. The Lamborghini eased forward slowly, its headlights illuminating the path ahead as it left the parking lot behind. And as the sleek car disappeared into the night streets of the city, the lesson of the evening remained behind like a quiet echo. A reminder that dignity does not need to shout to be powerful, and that the most meaningful victories are the ones that transform misunderstanding into understanding.